Oh, this is like I said, something I'm very excited about talking about. This series is just going to be so much fun. I really want you to understand, for those of you who are just beginning to explore Jesus, maybe you don't know, maybe this is like a New Year's resolution for you. You want to have a deeper relationship with God, or maybe you want to have a relationship with God. It is really about the word relationship. Some of you have been in church traditions in the past, and you kind of got soured on it because it felt like a ritual. You had rituals that were part of that. It's like, well, I go to church, I get baptized, I get confirmed. You know, I had confirmation when I was a teenager. Somebody asked me about it recently. I'm like, I don't remember any of it other than being bored to tears, sitting in that office, memorizing all this stuff, standing up in front. The best part of confirmation was, and I didn't know this happened, after it was over and you stood up in front of the whole church and memorized your little spiel, people gave you cash. I didn't know that was going to happen, but that was my favorite part of confirmation as a kid, just being honest. So it's like, you know, you have all these rituals and it just seems like, what's the point of that? What's the point of all this? And then you watch and you see people and they claim to love God and they come to church and you see what they do the rest of the week. You're like, what's the point of this? So the point of it is, it's not about rituals and it's not about rules. It is really about a real relationship with a real God. That's what it's about. And this series and what we're going to be focusing on this week and next week and the week after that are all going to be about building that relationship with God so you can be in the middle of an adventure with God where he does things like this. Part of what was hard about this message was figuring which stories to tell you. So one of my favorite stories about this adventure with God took place years and years ago. I talk all the time about the importance of building this relationship by spending a little time each day reading your Bible and praying. Matter of fact, if you at the end of November, go to YouTube and type in my name. All the messages that we do here are recorded and put on there. And you go to the last message in the month of November was the end of a series called Eternity. And I talked about how to spend time alone with God. Because some of you are like, I don't understand my Bible. I get nothing out of it. I don't know how to pray. It just seems like it's meaningless to me. And I explained what I do and I've been doing for 30 years. So I gave you some of my inside secrets on how to actually build that time with God. So if you go and do that and you start practicing this in 2019, isn't that weird to say? 2019. You can build this relationship with God where he will do things in your life and surprise you and put you in the middle of his journey with you. So I remember years ago, I got up, grabbed my Bible, started reading, and what you're doing whenever you're reading your Bible is you're just reading until something jumps off the page. Something strikes you as unusual or surprising. It's like, oh, I never noticed that before. And so that morning I was reading, and all of a sudden, I don't remember where I was reading. I have it journaled somewhere. And I read this verse. I'm like, wow, that really surprises me. So I grabbed my notebook. Whenever something strikes you in the Bible, you write about it. So I wrote out the verse, and I'm like, why did that strike me? And I wrote, I have no idea. I have no idea why that just struck me. And there's this application piece that we taught in that message. If you go back and watch that message, you'll get all of this. And I'm like, I have no idea what I'm supposed to do with this. No, that doesn't happen very often. Normally, when something strikes me when I'm reading the Bible, I know why it struck me. I know what I'm supposed to do with it. I follow that little thing that I taught you at the end of November. And I'm like, okay, this is what I need to work on in my life. And it's very clear. And that day it was very, very unclear. And I've never had that before or since. And I'm like, I have no idea what to do with this. I just know this verse really struck me hard. Don't know what to do. And I'm like, all right, God, well, you had it strike me for a reason. I don't know what that's about. And I went off to work. Finished my prayer time, went to work, and later that day, there's a knock at my door in my office, and this woman came in to see me, and she was having a really, really hard day. Matter of fact, she'd been having a hard time for a while. And she had made some decisions in her past that had really cost her a lot, cost her significantly, and she sat in that chair, and she started talking about how she felt so hopeless about her future, like her decisions meant God was just kind of done with her. And as she talked about the pain, I'm sure what was on my face was just absolute shock. Because as she talked about the pain that was in her heart, it was exactly what I had just read in that verse that struck me so hard. And I'm like, oh, it wasn't about me. So I picked up my Bible and said, can I show you something I read this morning? And I opened up my Bible to that verse and showed it to her, and she just started weeping because it was exactly what God needed to say to her, and it wasn't even about me. It was about her that day. I have so many examples I could tell you, so many times in my life where God just does stuff like that time after time. So when I talk about the relationship with God and Christianity being an adventure, that's what I mean. I mean adventure. Is that how you would describe what it's like for you to follow Jesus? And some of you would use words like boring. irrelevant, tedious. No follower of Jesus ever used those words in the Bible. You will not find them. It's like, oh, following Jesus is so boring. That's not how it's supposed to be. That's not what it's about. And I realized years ago that I was making a mistake. Matter of fact, Christianity in America does this thing, and what we do typically is we invite everybody to come and hear a pastor, stand up and teach about God's messages. And I'm glad you come. I'm glad you enjoy these messages, but the reality is that's not the end goal of Christianity. The end goal of Christianity is not to have you come and listen to my messages about God. The end goal of Christianity is for you to learn how to listen to God. That's what I want for you. I want you to learn how to hear from God. And some of you don't even know that that's possible. You don't know what I'm really even talking about. And that's what I'm going to show you today. But for those of you who say you follow Jesus, I want to ask you this question. When was the last time you had any sense that God was trying to communicate anything to you? Can you even remember a time when it seemed like, oh my goodness, God really wanted me to know this or do this or be a part of this? Because if it's been a while, then I am so glad you're here. And I'm so glad you're here for this start of this series, because this is going to be a series where we're going to talk about what God wants to do with things like this. I will guide you. Look what he promises. I, God, will guide you along the best pathway for your life. I will, and look at this. This is a verbal word, right? I will advise you and watch over you. This is what God is offering you. And I want to show you how to do that in this series. So we're going to talk today about how to actually hear from God. That's what I want to show you. So in your program are these notes. Would you please open your notes? Grab a pen. There'll be some things you're going to want to write down as we go into this today. I want to encourage you, and welcome those of you watching on YouTube. Glad you tuned in today. In the comments section below are these notes. I want to ask you to open those up and fill them in as we go through this today. Oh, this is just going to be a lot of fun to talk about. So let's jump right into this. Number one, the first thing you got to sort out is this. You got to sort out what you believe about God and his speaking ability today. Is God mute? Is he done speaking? I actually believe what I wrote right there. You may not believe that. I hope by the end of this message today that you do, but I believe that God still speaks today. If you're going to do any of what I'm talking about, you got to start here by getting to the point where you recognize that that's a true statement, that God still speaks today. So and I want you to know very clearly, what I'm teaching you today is controversial in the world of Christianity, okay? There will be people who would write blogs against what I'm saying. So I want to be really honest about that. Here are a couple of views that are very, very prominent in American Christianity today. The first one is that God only really speaks to, and spiritual giants isn't the accurate, it's not exactly what they would say. There was a book written by an author. I don't want to quote the book. I don't want to tell you the author. I hope you never encounter the book, but I read it and it's very popular and it's about the will of God. And the author said, God really only spoke to people who were fulfilling the salvation plan of God, and that's it. So if you're not one of those people like Abraham or Isaac or Jacob or Moses or Paul or Peter, then he just doesn't speak to you. Matter of fact, in the book, he actually says, there are no instances in the Bible in which God gives special and specific guidance to the ordinary believing Christian in the details of their personal existence. I could not more fundamentally disagree with this man. I actually read the book with an open mind years ago, and his basic premise is God doesn't have any plan for you. Live by wisdom. Make the wisest decisions you can. That's the essence of this. And so I was like, oh, okay. So I started living that way, and the result is you basically can go through your whole day and not even think about God, because why do you need him? Just make the wisest decisions you can. And after a while of living this way, I'm like, this is ridiculous. This isn't what I believe. This is cutting God out of my life. The outcome of this belief is just do what you want. You got the Bible to guide you, but just do what you want. God doesn't really have a plan for your life. I could not more fundamentally disagree with that view. But then there's another view that is very common. There are plenty of people in our communities today that believe this. God doesn't speak. He's spoken through the Bible, and that's it. And here are some of the things that you can read. You can find this everywhere online. We have his words, and they are sufficient for us. We now have the completed Bible. It contains all we need to know. God tells us everything we need to know in the Bible today. And there are a lot of people who believe that. A lot of people in our communities who believe that. And if they heard me speaking today, they'd be getting mad as I go through this today. And that's okay. I'm not really worried about that. I want to show you what I believe, because I believe in a personal God who is here who has a plan for your life, who wants to guide you through that verse that we already quoted. He wants to advise you and guide you and watch over you. That's what I believe. He has advice for you. That's what he says. I believe that. And again, I know in the Bible, our God, when you see how he interacts with people, it was very verbal. There was audible voice, visions, angels, dreams, and prophets, and blinding lights, and fingers on a wall, and a donkey even. So I've never heard him speak through a donkey. As a matter of fact, most of these I haven't heard. But these are just, God is a communicating God. He's like, I want you to know what I want you to do. I want you to know this. And we have a tremendous advantage because of Christianity, what happened with Jesus on the cross after he died and rose again. Now, here's what we get. Paul wrote this to the Corinthian church. He said, don't you realize about yourselves that Jesus Christ is far away in heaven and you can't really have access to him? No. We don't go to a church to worship God there because that's where God is. You who follow Jesus brought Jesus with you today because he lives inside of you. It's one of the coolest things about Christianity. If you will put God the Father, and what's revealed in the New Testament is that God the Father stands there with a gift for every human being on earth, every single one. If you will let him, if you will turn your life over to Jesus, Jesus Christ will forgive you. He will begin his work inside of you. He comes to live inside of you. Now, I can't explain that because I am not omnipresent, the theological word for God being everywhere at once. I am in one area, one place at a time, and God isn't. He's not limited like that. He can come and live inside of us. I don't know how that works, but I know it's what he promised and it's what he's done, is at the moment you put your faith in Jesus Christ, God comes to live inside of you. And then what he does then is then those promises are yours. He will guide you. He will advise you. He will watch over you. And there are examples of this in the Bible. It says in Paul's missionary journey in Acts, it says after they'd come to Mysia, they tried to go to Bithynia, but the Spirit did not permit them. In other words, somehow God communicated to these guys, don't go there. That's not where I want you to go. We don't know what his form of communication was. We only know he did. Our God is a communicating God. And if you will understand this, you will get to be a part of an adventure where God begins to do this kind of stuff inside of you. And it's thrilling, absolutely thrilling. So but all of this begins with you sorting out, what do you believe? What do you believe about whether or not God still speaks today? Because if you don't think he does, he'll respond to that faith. According to your faith, it will be that way. But I believe he does. I believe in a God who has a personal plan for my life. And I believe that he wants to guide me into that path. So the second thing becomes true. Once you understand what he's offering you, then the second thing you got to do is train yourself to listen for God. Which is confusing for some people when they see that on the screen. It's like, well, wait a second. If he comes to live inside of me at the moment of faith, shouldn't I just be able to hear from him? That's not how this works. You can silence the voice of God. You can get so distracted and so wrapped up in everything the world has to offer, you don't hear him. And there's a great example of that. Years ago, I read the story of a couple of men who were walking in a very big and busy city. Lots of traffic, lots of street noise. And one of the men said to the other, he said, man, don't you love the sounds of crickets even in a big city? And the other guy's like, crickets? I don't hear crickets. I hear traffic. I hear the street noise. How can you hear crickets? Well, the other guy who said it was a zoology major. He had trained himself to listen for the sounds of nature everywhere he was. But instead of explaining this, what he did is he reached in his pocket and he pulled out a handful of change. And he held it up in the air and he dropped it onto the sidewalk. And you know what a handful of change sounds like when it lands on the sidewalk? As he dropped it on the sidewalk, 12 people around turned and looked. He picked up the change and he put it in his pocket and he said to his friend, we hear what we listen for. We hear what we listen for. Those crickets were there. Nobody else was listening for them. He was. God is here. The only question is, are we going to turn and listen for him? So then the question becomes, for those of you, this is the first time ever hearing about this, it's like a little freaky. It's like, what are you talking about? Are you saying that I'm going to be alone in my bedroom and all of a sudden I'm going to hear a voice, Brian? It's like, that's going to freak us all out. And defib machines associated with every Christian. So it's like, that's not what I'm saying. That's never happened. Thank God. Thank God. All right, so I'm not talking about an audible voice. I'm talking about some of the common ways in which God speaks today. Number one, hands down, is always through the Bible. That's why you have to get in the habit, even if all you're doing is downloading that free app on your phone called YouVersion and letting your phone send you one verse a day. At least that's better than nothing. I don't want you to stay there, but I want you to begin there. And then, so much does he speak through prayer. Some of you have no idea what that means, to say that God speaks to you through prayer. And again, that message at the end of November may be the thing you need to go and listen to if you don't know what it's like to have God communicate something to you when you're praying. He speaks through circumstances all the time. Isn't that true? Many of you have had this. It's like, I want this, I want this, I want this. God says, that door is closed to you. Some of you, this just happened recently. He spoke to you through circumstances. You may not have liked the message, but he made it clear that's not the path you're going down, right? He speaks through circumstances all the time. He speaks through other people, speaks through Christians. How many times have you ever been in a church service? And this happened to me many, many times. I've been listening to a sermon, listening to someone else teach the Word of God, and all of a sudden something that just I needed so badly to hear was right there. You ever have that happen? He speaks through other Christians, and then he speaks through, and this is the one that people really weird out over, these inner whispers or promptings. It's God who lives inside of us, is a communicating God, and at times he kind of prompts you or directs you or guides you from within, sometimes called whispers. It's like he's saying, I want you to do this. I want you to give this. I want you to go here. I want you to apply for that. And it's just this kind of silent, repetitive, or very quiet, repetitive whisper inside. That's why you have to train yourself to actually listen for it. Let me give you an example of this, because this is, again, where so many Christians are like, no, that's not true. That's not true. So let me give you an example. You tell me how you can explain this one, all right? So there was a woman who attended a church that was so healthy. It's called the Dream Center. Pastor Chris Hodges. I love what this church model is. It's all about serving the community in radical ways, and so she was a part of this thing. They serve all kinds of needs. I mean, it doesn't matter what your need is in that community, the church is the center for it. And they serve and serve, whether it's hunger issues or addiction issues, it doesn't matter what it is. Everyone knows in that community you can go to the Dream Center Church and they will serve you. And so she worked there. And she did what I talked about. Every morning she got up, set her alarm a little early so she could spend time reading her Bible and praying before she went to her job. So she got up early that morning, and as she was praying, she just kept having this inner prompt from God, and it was just 2 words. Talk about making you feel crazy. This is how it is sometimes. The words were wool socks. Repeatedly. Wool socks, wool socks, wool socks. Like, I'm trying to pray. And sometimes it doesn't make any sense, right? Some of you know what I'm talking about. You've been a follower of Jesus. You know what I'm talking about. There are times this prompting from God doesn't make any sense. And so she finally is like, all right. She got up, stopped praying, went over to her drawer, pulled out some wool socks, put them in her purse so she could finish her prayer time. She's like, I have no idea what this is about. So she went to the Dream Center Church. She was early that morning. She was going to be opening it up for the day. And she pulled up in front, and there was a prostitute passed out on the stairs. So she opened the door, carried the woman in, just held her as she started to wake up. And as she started to wake up, she was shaking, and the girl was just holding her, and she said, the woman's name was Lisa, and Lisa said to the prostitute, she said, if there's anything you could have right now, what would it be? And the woman said, wool socks. Lisa almost burst into tears. She pulled out the wool socks from her purse, and the woman said, they even match my dress. I love what Lisa said. God is great not just because nothing is too big for him. God is great because nothing is too small for him. God is great because nothing is too small for him. A sparrow doesn't fall to this ground without him noticing and caring. Do you understand that? Do you know that? It's just amazing. There's a tiny little book of the Bible, 1 chapter long. Some of you are like, I want to read my Bible today. Here's the 1 chapter. Go read the book of Jude. It's 1 chapter long. You say, I read a whole book of the Bible today. 1 chapter, just a few verses. And in verse 3, there's a prompting. He says, beloved, while I was making every effort to write to you about our common salvation, so this is what it's like. I wanted to write to you about this, our common salvation. I felt, that's often how we word our promptings. I felt the necessity to write to you appealing, a totally different thing, that you contend earnestly for the faith which was once for all handed down to the saints. That's what a prompting sounds like. I had planned to do this, but as I started doing it, all of a sudden I just had this sense that I was supposed to do this. That's what a prompting sounds like. That's a prompting from God. I had this intention and God had a different intention. That's why you have to develop this ability to have your ears open to the God who lives within. Now, what will this sound like? There's no way for me to actually classify this, but I'll tell you what, sometimes his prompting or his message to you, sometimes God says any of these things. He could be telling some of you, just hang on. Some of you, that's the message that God brought you in here for you to hear today, is God is saying that to you today. He's saying hang on, or he's saying keep going, or trust me. He's saying here's something I want you to do, or something I want you to say, or something I want you to write, or something I want you to give or change. Sometimes what God is trying to do when he's whispering is comfort you. So much of what he wants to do is comfort and reassure you, or remind you, or convict you, or direct you. In my lifetime, having done this for so long, there have been so many times that God has said, hey, pay for that person's meal or groceries or bills. Write that person an encouraging note. I can't tell you how many times I've written that note in faith, not knowing what the person needed, and the response back was, oh my goodness, you said exactly what I needed to hear today. It's because God knows what they needed to hear. And it's not our job to figure it out. Our job is just to obey it. Or go over to that, give this to that person, stay here a little longer. Trust me, there's so many things he could be saying to you. It's why, I don't know how many of you were ever part of Hidden Valley when we did money giveaways. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this, in the church I used to pastor, on once in a while, random Sundays, I never wanted anyone to know when it was happening, is we would give thousands of dollars away. And we would say, hey, we need you to volunteer, not knowing what you're volunteering for. And they'd come up on stage and we'd hand them envelopes anywhere from $20 to $100. And maybe some of you participated in these in the past when we did it. It was one of my favorite Sundays. But what I really loved was 5 or 6 weeks later, when all of those people had the money, we told them the same thing. We said, this isn't your money. You can't spend it on yourself. You hold this in your hand, and it is from God, and your responsibility is to pray this. God, who do you want me to serve with what you've given? By the way, that's what we're supposed to pray every day anyway. Who do you want me to serve with what you've given? And it's not mine, it's yours. What do you want me to do with this? And people would begin to pray that. And the stories we heard 5 weeks later, 6 weeks later, when everyone would, then you would just pay attention. I loved it because you had to listen to God. And all of a sudden, for the first time in many people's lives, they were listening to God. And they were saying, God, who do you want me to serve? And then God would show them. And the stories were incredible about people who, they didn't have the money to pay for this gas, or they didn't have the money to pay for their groceries, or pay this bill. And all of a sudden, as we were living our lives with our ears open to him, saying, who do you want me to serve for you? He'd say, that person, and we wouldn't even know why. We'd go up, and many times the stories were like, I felt so embarrassed about doing this. I didn't know what their response was going to be. And then they burst into tears because it was exactly what they needed, exactly at the moment they needed it. And they got to be a part of the adventure. So we used to have a thing, and I haven't done this in a long time. It'd be great. I just thought of it now. We used to have something called the $20 challenge. Some of you remember this. Carry a $20 bill in your pocket, and it's not yours. Keep it in your pocket, and then when you put your hand in your pocket or you feel it, remind yourself that it's not yours and say, God, who do you want me to give this to? And you can carry this experiment on. Who do you want me to serve with this? And it was a way for us to keep our ears open to God and listen to him, train ourselves to listen. The other thing I loved was this. We used to talk about the 10-second rule. Just do the next thing you're reasonably certain Jesus wants you to do and commit to it immediately in the next 10 seconds before you change your mind. So that's how promptings work. It's like you'll be going somewhere, you have your own plans, your own agendas, it's all scheduled out, and all of a sudden you'll see someone and a thought will pop in your mind, stop and give them a ride. Or, hey, pay for that person's groceries, or pay for that person's meal. But you've got an agenda. You've got places to go. And so you debate it and miss it. And so the 10-second rule was, in the next 10 seconds, commit to it. So if something pops in your mind this week, because our God is a God who does want to communicate, listen to that whisper and say yes before you can talk yourself out of it. Just say yes. If you start doing this, you're going to have some pretty cool things happen. Because contrary to what so many people believe in this world, I believe in a God who's a personal God who wants to guide you and advise you and watch over you. And he will put you in the middle of an adventure with him. You got nothing to lose. Give it a try. Train yourself to listen to him. Now, by the way, next week's message, we are really going to go a lot deeper into that. A lot deeper in how to actually listen to him. So super excited about that. All right. The third thing to do is you have to learn how to test the promptings. And this works in a different scenario than just like what I said, hey, you're sitting there in a restaurant, you see somebody, and all of a sudden God just says, kind of prompts you, pay for that person's meal. You don't need to test that. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about testing it when somebody stands up, and this happens all the time in Christianity too. Somebody stands up and says, God said this is what we're supposed to do. That's exactly where you need to test it. So I had a friend who was, when I lived in Madison years ago, and he attended a church, and one Sunday where they really taught on this, so they all knew it, but it leaves you open for abuse. One day a woman came up to my friend, and he was single, and she said, God just told me in the church service today that you're supposed to marry me. Okay? In many churches, that's the trump card. God told me. Are you kidding me? I just want you to know, because there is the potential for abuse in this, that you never, ever, 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 ever just believe anyone who tells you, God told me. And you don't have to take my word for it. Look at this verse. Do not scoff at prophecy, and prophecy is somebody standing up saying, God told me. This is my message from God. He said, don't scoff at it, but don't believe it. Look what he says. Test everything that is said. So God never says this is a trump card. Well, I'm putting down a trump card. God told me we have to do this now. No. Never, ever, 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 ever just believe somebody who says, God told me. You test it. And there are some tests, and we've talked about this in the past. Does it fit the character of God? I literally years ago saw this video. I couldn't find the video, but it was a video of a guy who attacked a teenager who was skateboarding on the sidewalk. And when he was arrested, because it was captured on video, they got him. His excuse was, God told him to hit that kid. I'm not kidding. Isn't it true? I mean, we live in a world where people abuse this God told me all the time. Now, does that fit the character of God? Was God prompting that man? You need to punch this kid who's skateboarding on the sidewalk. Oh yeah, that's God, right? I mean, it's what causes so many people to be so disgusted by God. So disgusted by following Jesus is because God is accused of everything. God did not tell that man to punch the kid on the side, riding his skateboard on the sidewalk. It wasn't God. Okay? So much as, and he was adamant that it was. No, you're wrong. That's not God. What does the Bible say about this? This is really important. God doesn't have multiple personality disorder. Okay, I've said this many times. It's not like he said, don't steal unless your boss is ripping you off and he's not a good boss and they don't pay you what you deserve to be paid, then it's okay for you. Okay? He's not saying that. He's not saying it's okay for you to lie because your circumstances are different. He said, don't lie. He said, don't do these things. So there are things he's already made very clear. You don't have to pray, God, should I steal? The answer is no. He's already said this. Don't do it. Okay? And if he prompts you, it's not God. So God has already made some things very clear in the Bible he doesn't want you to do. You don't even need to ask him. Third, is it wise? And this one is tricky. Matter of fact, if you're following along, would you put a big star next to the word, is it wise? Or this one, is it wise? Because this one is a double-edged sword. Because the Bible is very clear. You need to make wise decisions, right? Wouldn't that be great if Americans started making wise decisions? Oh, yeah. Let me rephrase that. Wouldn't it be great if I started making wise decisions, right? It's easy to look around, but how about looking here? How about just looking at you? Wouldn't it be better if we all started making wiser decisions in 2019? That'd be really better. Our lives would get better, but there is a limit to this one when it comes to the promptings of God. Because it wasn't wise so many times in the Bible for people to obey what God was prompting them to do. It wasn't wise for Nathan to go confront King David over his sin with Bathsheba, where he had killed someone to cover it up, and God said, hey, you go confront him. That's not a wise thing to do, right? But there are times that God will prompt you to do something, and it doesn't appear to be very wise. And I'll give you an example of that in a moment. But he has his purposes. So this one's balanced. This one you got to know that there are times that he's going to ask you to do something that's way outside of the comfort zone. It wasn't wise for Peter to get out of a boat in the middle of a storm to try and walk to Jesus. That's not wise. You're going to drown, right? Unless Jesus tells you to do it. So there's a balance to this one. You got to be careful with this one. Does it fit who God made me to be? I saw this a lot over the years with people. I knew this person once who was convinced that God wanted to be a pastor, and they pursued this path. I've seen that many times. And it's like, yeah, but you don't have any of the core competencies necessary to be an effective pastor. But God just called me to be it. Okay. And they failed every time. which also ties into this last one. What do wise people say about this? When you're making a decision, do you ask wise people whose lives are really going well? Especially for me, I want to know people who really take their faith seriously. Are you willing to ask them what they think about it? Because what we tend to do is we're like, I get this in my heart. This is what I want to do. I may ask you, but I really don't care what you think. Or just not going to even ask you at all. It's like, no, you're going to test this stuff. So you get this idea that you're going to do this, quit your job and go do this. You should solicit the input of wise people. And again, they aren't the defining thing. God may ask you to do something that other people may look at and say, that's not very wise. But you need to know that these are the tests that the Bible would say you need to run your decisions through. All right, now, all of that comes down to this. This is what it all comes down to. I can show you from the Bible that our God is a communicating God, and I can show you how to learn how to listen for God and test what you think God is saying to you or someone around you. But ultimately, none of it, you will never experience God. You will never have an adventure with God till you do this. Till you just make up your mind. That's why that 10-second rule is good. I'm just going to do it. I am going to have an obedient attitude. God can prompt me. He can speak to me, show me what he wants, and I'm just going to do it. So you got to be willing to obey. Again, so many examples of this in the things I've read and the things I've experienced. I remember one time reading about this man who took his son. They were going to go do some shopping, and they went to a time machine first to go ahead and get some cash out. And after they withdrew the cash, they heard a knock on the window. Not a comforting feeling, right? And they turned, and it was this little old lady who was standing there, and he put his window down, and she said, "Would you be willing to help me buy some groceries?" And he was a Christian, and he immediately felt this prompting from God, say yes. Now, that wasn't what he had planned for the day. He had other plans, but he sensed immediately God wanted him to take this woman and buy her some groceries. So it turned out the groceries are for her grandkids. So he drove her to a grocery store, bought her what she needed, and as they were getting checked out, he asked, "Is there anything more that you need?" And she said, "Well, there's some medicines I can't afford." And so he said, "Well, just tell me what you need and I'll buy it." So bought the medicine for this woman too. And then as they were driving her to her apartment, the woman said this. She said, "You're a Christian, aren't you?" And he said, "Yes, I am." She said, "I thought so. Just before I saw your car, I was sitting on the bench at the bus stop and I prayed and I said, 'Jesus, would you please send me a Christian?'" And just think if he'd have said no. Just think if he'd have said, "I've got my plan. I've got stuff I got to do. I didn't budget for this." You need to know the reason why God is going to prompt you and guide you and direct you is because you are the answer to somebody's prayer. That's how he's going to use you. Do you know the joy that comes when he does that in your life? You think anything you can buy is going to create that kind of joy in your life? There is nothing like the thrill that comes from being in the middle of the adventure that God has for your life. Nothing like it. And it's what he wants for you. I believe in the truth of this verse. John 10:27, it says, "My sheep listen to my voice. I know them and they follow me." Now, the coolest thing about that, in that society, they understood what that meant. Shepherds, when they would go the sheep got to know the voice of the shepherd, and all the shepherd would have to do is say, "Come on along," and they would hear his voice. They'd follow him. You need to understand, if you decide to become a Christian, what you're saying is that you're deciding to become a person who follows the voice of Jesus. That's what you're saying. You're not becoming a church attender. You're becoming a follower of Jesus. And that means learning to hear his voice. That's what you're saying yes to. And then it'll all come down to this last verse. Look at this last verse in the bottom of your notes. 2 Thessalonians says, may God give you the power to accomplish all the good things, look at this, that your faith prompts you to do. When was the last time your faith prompted you to do anything? Can you think of something? If you can't, then it's time to make a change right here. It's time to make a change. Because God is a God who will prompt you and guide you if you'll let him. Years ago, I had a friend who loved bicycling. Top high-end bikes. And one day he got in his mind that he was going to start building bikes and selling them. Tough thing to do, right? Because he was building high-end bikes, but he loved it. And his business started just growing. Pretty soon he had a couple orders, then a few more orders, then a few more orders, but it couldn't, that's a tricky thing to balance because the high-end bikes are very expensive to build and to buy the parts to build them. So he had to wait oftentimes till the checks arrived from the bikes that he'd sent out, and if they were delayed getting there, I didn't send my check yet. It was really tight. And one time he got this order for 12 bikes. So it was going to be a lot of money. And so he's so excited. He built the bikes, and then he had to order some more things, including this clear coat finish that he always put on all of his bikes before he would send them off. And so he ordered among, this huge shipment. It finally came in the mail. He was so excited. He opened it up and said it felt like Christmas. He opened up all these boxes. He's looking through it, and all of a sudden he realizes the clear coat paint, which is fairly expensive, wasn't in there. He looked at his order. He'd forgot to order it. So he only had $115 left until the next check arrived, when it ever arrived. And it was going to cost most of that to buy this clear coat paint at the local shop where he would, if he didn't order it online where it was cheaper. And so he's like, oh man, what do I do? Because he was a serious follower of Jesus, and he believed that God had prompted him, these are his words, to give $100 in church that Sunday. So immediately, he knew he needed that money to buy the paint, or else he couldn't. His plan was to clear coat these things on Friday, let them dry all weekend, and ship them on Tuesday. All of his plans were going to be ruined if he didn't go to the paint store and buy that paint. So he prayed and said, God, is it okay if I don't give this $100? Can I just keep it, buy the paint, and send these out? I can give you more later. And still, the impression immediately from God was, no, you give that $100. And again, for some of you, this is such a weird thing to think about, having like a conversation with God like this. And that's what it's about. So he had a terrible attitude at church that Sunday. He's very honest about it. He had a miserable Sunday. And then in that church, they passed an offering plate. He did not want to do it. He said he opened up his wallet, put his $100 in there, and he was just mad at God. It's like, you don't understand. And so he went home and he's like, well, I can't finish these bikes. I got to wait till some of the checks from the previous bikes I sold come in, then I can buy the paint, then I can send them off. I'm really upset. And so he decided to work on a new bike, and then he realized he'd also forgot to order sandpaper, where sandpaper is cheap. So he's like, this is terrible. So he goes the next morning, Monday morning, goes to the paint store, to the bicycle supply shop in his town. He walks in, the guy behind the counter immediately recognizes him and goes, hey, just a second. And he goes in the back and he comes out with a big can of paint. Now, there's no label on it. Instead, there's just a piece of paper taped on the front. And the serial number is the number of the clear coat paint that he always used. He puts it on the counter and goes, isn't this the clear coat paint you use? And my friend said, yeah, that's what I use. And the guy said, well, we were unloading a shipment last night, and these cans fell off the top and knocked open, and so I quickly grabbed them and poured them into one. He said, I obviously can't sell it like this, so Merry Christmas. Slid it across the counter. And my friend still has that paint can to this day. You think you can't trust him? You think he doesn't know what he's doing when he tells you and prompts you and guides you? He knows exactly what he's doing. He's got you. He's got you. I know many of you, if I opened it up and said, tell me about a time when God prompted you and you obeyed, you could tell stories just like these. Because I've heard some of your stories. You obeyed when God said, why don't you write that person a note? And it was just what that person needed. Or why don't you pay for that person's meal? And you heard the emotion when you did that. You know it. This is how God works. Some of you, though, if I were to say, tell me the last time you sensed God was asking you to do anything, you can't tell me anything. And you are a Christian. You can be a Christian and not a follower of Jesus. You can be a Christian and not follow him and listen to his voice. I don't know why you do it. It's like winning the lottery and not cashing in the ticket. Because the greatest adventure awaits for you when you begin to follow Jesus. So for some of you, the most important thing is to get a $20 bill, put it in your pocket or your purse, and every time you see it or put your hand in and you feel it, you pray and say, God, this isn't mine, it's yours. Who do you want me to serve with this? And learn to listen to him. Some of you, you're beyond that. You hear these prompts once in a while. You're just not used to doing them, and it's time to actually make a commitment to that 10-second rule. If it prompts me, I'm just going to do it before I have time to talk myself out of it, because you don't want to miss what God has for you. For others of you, I could tell you so many stories in my life where God just showed up at the right moment and did this, and I had such joy, amazing times with God so many times. And some of you who are just exploring your faith here, you are not used to people talking about a real God and a real relationship, and that's what we're talking about. I really don't care, and God, honestly, and I'm sorry if this hurts your feelings, he really doesn't care how many times you attend church. Doesn't care at all. Doesn't care about all the religious things you've done in your past. They are not what he's looking for. He wants you. When he came to earth 2,000 years ago, when Jesus came to earth 2,000 years ago, he came to do was die on the cross for all that we've done that's wrong, so you and I could be completely forgiven and have a real relationship with a real God. He doesn't want your religious ceremonies. He wants you. Let me have you bow your heads. For some of you spiritually, this is the next step. God Almighty stands here with his hand extended to you today with a gift, and it is the gift of forgiveness and eternal life and an amazing adventure and all those promises about guiding and advising and watching over, all of it yours if you'll just take it from his hand. And he said, here's all I want from you. Believe in my son, Jesus Christ. That's what he says over and over again. Jesus said, this is the will of my Father, that you believe in me. This is where it all begins. You don't have to jump through any hoops for him. You just have to turn your life over to this living God. And you express your faith to him, and he will hear you today, and this is where it can begin. Again, there's nothing magic about these words. You just say something like this in your heart to Jesus. Say, Jesus, I'm turning to you today. I want this gift. I've heard that you died on a cross for me, and so I ask you to forgive me. I want to learn how to follow you. I want the adventure you're offering me. In Jesus' name, amen. Now, as we finish today, can I ask you all to open your program again? You got this little card in there. Would you take this slip of paper out? And again, if you're a regular attender, I ask you to do this every week. Just put your name down. But some of you prayed and you asked Jesus to forgive you. Would you check that little box right there? Let us know what you've done, or maybe you've recommitted your life to him today. Check that box. Some of you have something you want us to pray about. Put it in there, or a comment you want to make. Then we have a team of people who will pray for you each week. So please take a moment and fill this out. And then again, there are 2 offering boxes hanging on the back wall. Just drop this in there on your way out. Thanks for coming. Hope to see you again next week for part 2 of this.